Good afternoon, and thank you to IRA for the opportunity to talk from a personal perspective. I'd like to draw on personal talk to some of the points in relation to who we all are in terms of civic society, because fundamentally most of my experience around the subject that I suppose we're discussing today has been over 20 years of involvement and engagement within so-called civic society groupings and indeed statutory organisations, independent or otherwise, also. But I'd like to reflect for a moment on a personal experience. Firstly, coming on the bus here this morning, there's this extraordinary sense of watching pickets and listening to my wireless stuck into my ear, to water flooding out of all over the place. And I grew up in Mayo, where statistically it rains on average 3 days out of 4. So I have, I suppose, a high tolerance of water. And my brother used to push my wheelchair 3 kilometres to school. And I genuinely got very, very upset on the days I couldn't go to school because it rained. And I genuinely remember articulating, I really wish I wasn't born, and feeling that very strongly as a young child and as a teenager, because of how we organise things and because of the realities of that. That something as ordinary as rain can determine whether you get to go to school or not. So listening to that this morning, I have a real sense of, for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of reasons that we're definitely not in Kansas anymore. Just seeing Alva, about 5 years ago, Alva Smith and I were both on a panel in UCD, and I used the analogy of a Woody Allen film, as you may recall, where I said it was quite close to a general election at that stage, and I was genuinely depressed. I mean, in a very real sense of what that means. The Samaritans produced research during the summer, which illustrated the link of discrimination and depression, etc., as being very real. And I thought it was very interesting that an organisation like the Samaritans in Ireland are producing that kind of survey and quite clearly saying their finding. So I remember being very depressed, and that Woody Allen film, if any of you know it, is he's on a train, and it's all black and white, and everybody around him on the train is depressed. He looks over at another train across the way, and it's full of Marilyn Monroe types with champagne glasses, and they're having a ball all the time. They're having a hoot. And he just looks over at the train, and then he looks to this rather austere conductor who comes to check his ticket. And he suddenly looks at his ticket, and he looks at the train across the way, and it's quite apparent that he's on the wrong train. And that's how I felt 5 years ago. How I feel now is as if actually that train has stopped as well. And we're all now looking across at each other to say, what happens now? And this is dangerous, because the common mantra at the moment is we are where we are. You're familiar with that. I define this kind of speak as the constant state of nowism, now, in that we are always in the now. We can never reflect and we can certainly never plan and project. We are constantly in the now. And that's not something that has been a reality, and I'll link this back to my experience in relation to disability and disability activism in a moment. This is not a new phenomenon. If you're involved in activism and you engage with the state, that's constantly the mantra. All that has been different for the past 10 years is that the levels of resources available to the state, which enables its being able to manage, and the malleability of civic society has intensified. But I heard that phrase most definitely used in 2002, 2003, and it was following the then Disabilities Act being withdrawn, and we went in following that general election of that year to government buildings, to the Department of the Taoiseach, and a charade, really, retrospectively, of another consultation process where we were, as civic society, being engaged with. And that's where I heard that phrase again. We couldn't actually talk about the fact that we had just been through 12 years of intensive consultation. As far as the Department of the Taoiseach is concerned, at that point in time, the general election had been won, and the party was still on outside, by the way. General election had been won, and we had no leverage. Yeah, we had no leverage because we had used up all our brownie points. We had used up all our empathy, you know, because the state had available to it huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of money to communicate a message that says that disability as an issue has been dealt with. Of course, that's not the case. Why, I suppose, after 20 years of activism, I feel quite depressed, really, in terms of where it is we are. You know, what are our choices? What are the things that we can actually do? Does require us to reflect a little in terms of what our role has been over the past decade, in terms of some of the choices that we've exercised. And I just make a few observations which I think are really important and pertinent to some things that were said earlier. I'm really committed to human rights and a human rights-based approach. A lot of the activity areas of process that I've been involved in make that clear. And that's delivered some dividends. I don't want to be totally pessimistic and negative. Equal opportunities has actually delivered dividends for disabled people who can participate in an equal opportunities world, right? I'm concerned for those disabled people who live in closed spaces, who live in realities where that has been challenging always and is going to be intensely challenging going forward. Now, how that's going to change is not going to depend on a new wave of activism from disabled people, their families, etc. It has to involve some kind of connection with our broader human rights groupings, and that has to involve a breaking down of territories in terms of who owns human rights. Human rights is not owned by lawyers. Human rights is not owned by community activists. It's not owned by academics. It's not owned by any group of people who experience whatever the reality of discrimination that they experience, that we experience. Human rights is owned by all of us, and it cannot be a divide and rule context where my issue or my experience of discrimination takes center stage for 1 minute, and I move back, and then it's the next group, and then it's the next group. Because fundamentally, that is how the state has played all of us over the past decade in many respects. And I believe, and it may be controversial and may come up in terms of the analysis that follows, I believe whilst there have been some gains in terms of equal opportunities, I think opportunities following the enactment of the Human Rights Act following the Good Friday Agreement